Now to the business of the evening. Tonight, we're really honored to have as our presenters two of the most prominent historians of the region in Florida, in our locality. Ginger Pedersen is the Vice President of Information Services at Palm Beach State College, and Janet DeVries Naughton is an archivist and history professor at Palm Beach College. Also, both of them, as I'm sure all of you know, have been key players in the Boynton Beach Historical Society and other history-related organizations and activities. They have been perhaps the most prolific bloggers in the region on a wide variety of topics related to Boynton Beach, West Palm, Palm Beach County, the rest of Florida as a whole. And they are also both noted authors, written several books individually and jointly on topics that are related to pioneers, local history and events and so on. This evening, we are going to hear, for the first time for us, a piece of very important original research that grew into a book, published book available at Amazon and your local bookstores, called Pioneering Palm Beach, the Deweys in the South Florida Frontier and the South Florida Frontier, that traces the amazing history of the Dewey families in South Florida from the frontier days in the late 1880s and continuing on into the 1920s as they assumed an important role as major players in the sort of social scene of Palm Beach County through that era. And it illustrates a lot of aspects and dimensions of life, lifestyle and social life in the region. So with that brief introduction, I will turn it over to Ginger.
Great. So we're going to begin the presentation. Everybody can see the screen? Looking good? All right, so we're going to go ahead and start. So this whole quest started very innocently with merely a question. There were some disagreements among members of the Boynton Beach Historical Society about who had actually founded the town of Boynton and who was the movers and shakers. And it also was about where exactly the hotel was that Major Boynton owned. Some people said it was like right next to Ocean Avenue. No, it was a little north. So anyway, I said, Janet, why don't we go to the courthouse and just figure this out? And when we did that, you get these beautiful, huge books that weigh about 40 pounds each. And it tells you all of the land transactions between the seller and the buyer, the grantor and the grantees. And when we went to the page that recorded all of those first transactions in the 1890s and the early, the teens, we had a real mystery because we didn't see Major Boynton over and over again. The name that we saw was somebody named Birdie S. Dewey, and then we saw some entries for a Fred S. Dewey. And we're like, who the heck are these people? And why are they selling all the land that constituted downtown Boynton Beach?
Hold on a second, I just, my screen, something happened. Don't you love the tag team effort here? Okay, we're back. Sorry about that. Okay, so in our quest to look for who was Birdie Dewey, we started out, believe it or not, with her husband's name. Because if you think about it, back during that time period when they were here, most of the women weren't even really known by their first name. They were usually Mrs. So-and-so. So when we looked, we found her husband, Fred Sidney Dewey, on the Lake Worth Pioneers Association page. So it gave some basic background information on them. And then we actually found her full name. We had just been calling her Birdie, right? Like Birdie, tweet, tweet. But we found out that her real name was Byrd Spilman Dewey. And then, like any researcher, we were off on a tangent to try to figure out who was Byrd Dewey. So we did find this Who's Who article, which was really wonderful. And as we started to go through it, it gave so much of her biological information. It actually let us know that she was an author, It told us that she was from Covington, Kentucky. And it also said that she was a grandniece of Zachary Taylor, President Zachary Taylor. Of course, it gave her husband's name, Frederick Sidney Dewey. I don't know if that rings a bell. It talked about that she had lived in Maysville and then Illinois. But wait, there's more. It said author of Bruno. So now we had some different things to go by. We also found out that not only did she have her name that she was known under, but she also had pen names. So we got to have some fun chasing down those pen names. And then what was even most fun was that she had a mysterious address in West Palm Beach. And it was just simply listed as Ben Trovato.
So with all of these clues, we knew we had something that was going to be going. And this is just a snippet of an email that's almost 10 years old now. And Janet wrote me, do you feel we're onto something? And we really were. So we started to comb through all of the resources, and Janet will talk a little bit more about those.
Right. So being a researcher, we're actually very lucky that we're living in a time that so much information has been digitized, and even more, as you know, every day. So we looked through a bunch of different newspaper archives, like the Florida Digital Newspaper Library. The University of Florida has all kinds of information online, including Chronicling America. The Palm Beach Post used to have kind of like this archaic historic archive, which now has been replaced with newspapers.com. That's so much better because you can actually find things indexed and you can save them. But we started going through all of the different newspapers to try to figure out this, basically this puzzle. And we did it together, which made it a lot of fun.
Yeah, so we also had family resources. We found family members from Fred Dewey, who was related to George Dewey, of course, the famous admiral. We found members of the Spilman family as well. And all of these together, we went through, of course, the more traditional research and resources like Full Tree, Family Search, and Ancestry. And this was a picture that we obtained from the Spilman family. This on the end is the only childhood photo we have ever seen of Mrs. Dewey. This is her mother, her father, and at least 4 of her 5 siblings. And she had 3 siblings that passed away as children.
So in the 1960s, someone besides us was looking for Byrd Spilman Dewey. So his name was Judge Hoover. He was from Ohio, and he actually came down here to Florida, and he stopped in the Historical Society, and he started asking some questions. He wanted to know who Mrs. Dewey was. He had found out some biographical information about Mrs. Dewey's father, and he knew that she had been an author. So what they did then was, you know, they put newspaper articles just like this one, Visiting Judge. You can see that that was in the 1966. So luckily, there were still some people alive that had met her. So people responded, and they were able to give some information firsthand.
And that was so he left us a research piece that was very valuable to us and gave us the clues that we could follow through. Her father was a lawyer by trade, and at the age of 48, he changed his whole career and became a minister. But he was also a composer, and I'll play a little bit of his most famous song.
Green praise, float gently, I'll sing thee a song in thy praise, like Mary.
And it's a very familiar tune. It was one of the most popular songs of the 19th century. And they didn't have really royalties as they understand them. So his total profit was 12 copies of the sheet music. So he didn't become fabulously wealthy over this very, very famous song of history. These are Fred Dewey's parents. This is Lonson Dewey and his wife, Nancy Rice Dewey. And we got these pictures from a member of the Dewey family, and we'll talk about that adventure a little bit later in the presentation.
So Fred was in the Civil War, and he went into the Civil War. He mustered in 1962, and he was actually promoted to a sergeant major. But while he was in the Civil War, just like many people that were in the Civil War, he contracted an illness. Are some of his records, and it actually goes through and it tells that he was injured and he also had developed tuberculosis. So the person who was writing this report basically said that not only after 2 months of not being able to work, he was being discharged, obviously honorably, but that he was so ill that he couldn't even be a candidate for what they called back then the Invalid Corps.
So he was ill, and that was one of the reasons that they eventually wanted to come to Florida. Now, Mrs. Dewey had a tragedy very early in her life. When she was just 10 years old in 1866, her mother boarded this steamship to visit an older brother in Cincinnati. And as the steamship pulled away from the wharf in Maysville, one of the livestock on board kicked over a lantern and caused a fire, which immediately engulfed the ship. And the pilot of the ship rammed the ship into the shoreline so that people could jump off. And Mrs. Dewey's mother ran down the deck, and just at that time, a steam pipe exploded and just doused her with scalding boiling water, and she was severely burned. She was taken back to her home, and she died the next day. And incredibly, she was the only person who died in that wreck. And she left behind 6 children for her husband to raise. And it was a real tragedy in her life. And she spoke of it this way. And when I read her book, Bruno, I didn't make the connection until I knew her story. But she said, "A fire fills me with horror, especially if it breaks out in the night. It always reminds me of the burning of a big steamer that happened one awful night in my 10th year." You could read that in the book and it would think, oh, well, gee, I wonder what happened. And it was quite chilling to know what actually had happened.
So in 1877, Byrd married Fred Dewey, and her father actually was the officiant at the marriage in her church. So this was in Salem, Illinois, and it had some really nice things about her. It said the bride is a charming young lady of excellent education that respects, well-informed, agreeable, and lovable companion, the daughter of Reverend Spilman. So they were leaving for their honeymoon in Chicago. And I know we have several people here that are from Chicago. So after that, shortly after they were married, because of Fred's health, they began to talk about Florida. Those of you that recall back then that Florida was really one of the last frontiers in the United States. It was kind of a mysterious area, but as transportation started to open up a little bit, people started to come down here. So here you can see a steamer on the St. Johns River. Obviously, it would take a while to get here from Illinois. If you had lived out in the east, you could actually take the outside, but they came down through Florida, past Jacksonville, and into the area which is known, it's near Mount Dora. You can see Mount Dora over there on the very left, but they settled in a place which was called Zellwood.
Yeah, and Zellwood is right down here on the old Orange Blossom Trail.
In her book, she actually calls it Melonville, which was, or no, she called it Lemonville.
Yeah, yeah. So this is, and one of the examples of, they bought some land in Zellwood. Mrs. Dewey's cousin was a co-founder of the town of Zellwood, which still exists. And so they bought land thinking they were going to be orange barons. They're going to have an orange grove and sell oranges. I mean, heck, you live in Orange County. What the heck else do you do but have an orange grove? And so to kind of tide their way through, because it takes several years for the orange trees to grow, they thought they would grow vegetables. And the whole enterprise did not prove to be very successful at all. And Mrs. Dewey wrote about camp food. And this is a lovely quote. She talked about alligator meat, that they tried alligator one day. And she says, when the steak was cut, the meat looked white and fine grained like the more delicate kinds of fish. And she said, when cooked, it was very inviting, being a compromise between fish and the white meat of domestic fowls. So Mrs. Dewey said that alligator tastes like chicken, right? That famous, like anything you don't know what it is, oh, well, it tastes like chicken. But she said, once you eat it once, you never want to eat it again. So not quite sure what happened with their alligator meal, but this is a drawing from one of her books. We see her dog Bruno here. And of course, here's the alligator about to be disposed of. And this is Fred and his trusty axe about to fell that alligator.
So Ginger and I took many field trips as we were trying to discover what was happening in the book, and we were really trying to track her down, find out if any of the archives had anything. So we went to Eustis. We found the Historical Society, a very small, very rural historical society, and then we found the library. So we went into the library and they showed us the newspapers that they had. And as we were leaving, we walked out, we realized that the library was on Dewey Street. So then we went back in and we asked, we said, why is that named Dewey Street? And they said it was the custom of the day for people to name the streets after the families that lived there.
And the Deweys had a house indeed on Dewey Street. When they had moved from Zellwood, Fred took an accounting job in Eustis, and so they named the street in their honor, and that stands till today. And nobody knew why it was named Dewey Street, which is interesting. And when you do research, not everything you find is happy and nice and fun. In her book, Bruno, she speaks about the baby that she had, and she never gives the baby's actual name in the book. And it was a very sad tale because, as was so common at that time, is the baby died as an infant. And she gave this very sad quote. She says, "Then darkness. It is night in a long white draped room. One end of it is lighted by a lamp having a rose-colored shade. In the middle of the lighted end stands a crib. A little white-robed form lies within." When we did research where Mrs. Dewey is interred, the woman informed me that her brother was also interred in the same cemetery. And she says, well, it's very odd because her brother is interred in the infant section next to a baby named Elizabeth Dewey. And we realized that that was indeed, you don't know, this book was so autobiographical in nature. And that just confirmed that this was not just something written for literary or drama effect, that it actually was a baby that they lost. This is a portrait that we found from the Dewey family on an adventure that we took. And this is how they appeared in 1885 in Jacksonville, just as they were about to begin their adventure here in Palm Beach County.
So in 1885, there wasn't very much in this area. It was pretty much wild country. Henry Flagler hadn't even set his eyes on the area. And we all know that what Lake Worth is and that the body of water is named after General Worth. But back then, people just called places regionally, like you had the Lake Worth country, the Indian River country, and Biscayne country. She wrote about it, and of course, she had a beautiful way of describing things. And she said, it was a land of romance, fanned by mysterious, spice-laden breezes.
Wouldn't you want to go somewhere like that? I mean, that's like the best tagline that Palm Beach County could ever use.
So at that time, people were able to file homestead claims. You could get up to 160 acres of free government land. So this is the first claim that Fred tried, that he actually went. And so you would actually go to Gainesville and you would file your claim. So it says Fred S. Dewey, Lake Worth, Florida, and it has your section in Township 43, Range 43, containing, I think it's 76 acres.
76 acres, and this was on Christmas Eve, 1886, that he put in the claim. So we know where Fred was on Christmas that year.
And this is the masthead for Guy Metcalf's Tropical Sun. So this issue is April 1st, 1891. Most of these issues are available online for Chronicling America. And the person who drew the masthead in the back, which is just so beautiful, was George Potter.
And Mrs. Dewey served as their first columnist. So she was the first weekly columnist in South Florida history. This is just a portion of a photograph of the pine woods. This is how West Palm Beach would have appeared. This is Sacadilla. So this is the street that runs parallel to the Dreyfus School. And so all of West Palm Beach and all of Northwood was covered by a thick forest of sand pines. And sand pines are a little different than the tall pine trees like you see behind Ted in his background. There are very few stands left of sand pine. What was once thousands of acres is probably down to less than 100 now in Palm Beach County of sand pine forest. And you can see how thick it was. And even Mrs. Dewey said how it invigorated her husband, bringing back those boyish enthusiasms which he had left behind him years ago. So it really agreed with his health.
So this is an article talking about her, and every article that we found, it was kind of like another piece of the puzzle. So this talked about some of her other books. It says that author of Bruno, published by Little Brown and Company of Boston, which is a really good publishing house, and it's now in its 3rd edition. So she had the 1899, there was a 1908, and then a 1924 edition. But it also tells of some of her other works. So it says that she wrote Peter the Tramp, and it was published by the Animal Protective League. So she was very helpful for animals. And it was also published by the Record Company of St. Augustine. Then it said something, and it said her recent book, The Blessed Isle, and she has a serial story now appearing in the Florida Review entitled From Pine Woods to Palm Groves. So library people know that OCLC, you can go and you can look up different books. So when I looked up in the library catalog for all of these different books, I found that one library had From Pine Woods to Palm Groves. So of course, you know what that meant, field trip, right? So I was able to go up to Jacksonville, to the Jacksonville Public Library, and meet with the archivist up there, and they wheeled out this cart. And on the cart, there was a whole year's worth of the Florida Review. So in there were stories by other people. So, you know, I peel back the cover and I look at it, and then I start to read it, and I start to take photographs of it. And then I realize, oh wait, I've got to go through all of these books, and my phone is starting to die. But this is an actual picture that I captured with my iPhone. So it was a serial story, and that was common for the day. So people would purchase the magazine, and then they would wait for the next one to come. So these were actually huge bound volumes at the place. So this was 1899 by Byrd, Spilman Dewey, and it's a beautiful story.
It is a beautiful story, and it's really nice. So this is where most of that book took place. This is northern West Palm Beach. All of this, where you see this kind of looks like a body of water, this has all been filled in. Today, if you would be here in a car, you would be basically going up Australian Avenue. So they had 2 lots. These are the 76 acres. This would be about where 25th Street is today, this line, if you're familiar with West Palm Beach. And so a lot of their land was that high land that makes up the Northwest Hills neighborhood of West Palm Beach, which is very high. If you've never driven in there, it's really, really quite interesting property. So they took out this homestead, and when you did a homestead, you actually had to say what kind of house that you built, and that, you know, it's a building, and they moved into the house. You actually had to live on the property. I have lived on this land since May of 1887. So that's where they lived. And he talks more about the land and things that they did there.
Yeah, so this was very informative. It talks about all of the different improvements they did, that it was a frame house, how large it was, what type of windows it had, if it was tongue and groove. It also mentioned that they had chickens, And then it talked about all of the wonderful fruit trees that they put. They cleared 2 acres and they had orange, lime, alligator pears. Does anyone know what alligator pears are? And then they had sugar apples and tamarinds, coconuts, guavas, all kinds of different things.
Yeah, alligator pears are avocados. That was the pioneer name for them. So we think that this is a little picture of their very modest home that was accidentally captured. This is actually the garbage burning place in West Palm Beach. And if you look carefully, you'll see this little house tucked in the woods. We're about 90% certain that was the Dewey house because there was nothing else up there in Northwood Hills at the time. And so it was just accidentally captured in this particular photograph near the garbage dump that became a place where the victims, the Black victims of the 1928 hurricane, are basically buried in that vicinity. Fred was working at this store. This is the U.D. Hendrickson store, which is about where Palm Beach Golf Course is right now, perhaps a little bit north of there. But there was only 2 stores in the area, one about where the Flagler house is, and this store. That's it. That was the only 2 places that you had to do all of your shopping. So it was either Hendrickson or the store there owned by the Burkhart family. That's it. That's all you had.
So as we came through doing our research, it became a little bit of a game of hide and seek. We would hear about something and then we would be looking for it. And then pretty much when we least expected it, it would just appear.
And it was because the one story that we had located all of the works that were mentioned except one. And the one we couldn't find was called Who Seeks Finds. So guess what we found?
This is a picture of her little story, her booklet that she wrote. You could see that she illustrated it, and then she also used a little bit of thread to actually make it into a book. So it was a wonderful story that has her autograph right there at the bottom. And you can see the palm trees in the water at the very top, along with the signature birds. So it was right there under our nose. We found a copy at the Boynton Library, and we also ended up finding a copy later, but it was a very exclusive book.
Little thing. And inside of that book, it had a clue for me because I could never figure it out because I read it and it says written for the Century Company and reprinted. And I thought the Century Company was a major publisher of magazines. If they wrote it and reprinted it, how come I could never find it? So once I had the story text, I could Google some of the words. And I did that. And here it was, Who Seeks Finds. And this is just a little bit of the story. The reason I couldn't find it, it was written under a pen name. And that pen name was Judith Ray. So there we had it that went on.
So this is another little story that she wrote as a columnist. And I want to think of it as it's a little bit sort of like the homemaker that would, or an Eloise. And she wrote about building furniture in her home. So she would sew and make the curtains. She would make the cushions and the tablecloths. And then she also would design and do her little nooks and crannies. So she could make window seats. She could make built-in bookcases. Moldings, half rounds, quarter rounds. You could get them and then you could add them to dress up your house. And that was written under her pen name of Judith Sunshine.
So now we had 2 pen names, Judith Ray and Judith Sunshine. And it was under Judith Sunshine that she did almost all of her magazine writing. So we could go into archives like Good Housekeeping, Ladies Home Journal, and search for author Judith Sunshine and find a lot of her works that way. Now, this continuing theme of Who Seeks Finds. So I found finally Mr. Dewey's great great nephew. And he lives where? In Wisconsin, in Onalaska, Wisconsin. So we flew to Wisconsin, to Madison, to drive there. And he was very kind enough to share all of his family archives. And so we took the things out of his car, and we got one of these hotel carts so that we could scan the entire collection. And so I thought, well, let me take a picture of the collection before we start taking it all apart. And as I look at it, something caught my eye, and it was this. Happened to be framed as "Who seeks finds." And we took it as a clue from Mrs. Dewey. So it was just one of those things that was one of those spooky moments that we had along the way, where those words just happened to be framed perfectly by the way the documents were put into the box. So next, we have them moving. So they sold the 76 acres up in northern West Palm Beach, and they wanted something. I mean, you know, you're going up in the world, you want waterfront. So they wanted waterfront. And this was a portion of the land that they bought in West Palm Beach. This was a typical house of the time. This was their neighbor, Ben Lanehart, and this is his palmetto shack, which was maybe a couple hundred yards from the Dewey house. So this was your luxury home of the time. You can see it has a pipe here to capture water, a little rain barrel. You've got a ladder to fix your roof all the time, and you've got home protection right here. You got your trusty rifle.
So it was then that they moved to West Palm Beach, and we were able to finally figure out what that mysterious home with just the name of Ben Trovato was. So we found this picture at the Historical Society of Palm Beach County, and I want to say we were just blown away with the octagonal piece on there with the very, very long wharf. As you know, that it goes, the water is shallow, so you have to go out very far. Here's a close-up of it, and you can actually see that the Deweys are sitting on the first floor of the porch, on the veranda, facing the water. And all around them, there's little banana trees, and there's orange trees, and there's all kinds of foliage. And they had a beautiful, large piece of property there.
I mentioned there will be cats in the presentation. Mrs. Dewey was a huge cat fan. In fact, her second book, The Blessed Isle, was all about her cats. And here we have Velvet, who she's holding, and she's in her signature white dress. And you can see some periwinkles behind her, some small palm trees. So she called the estate, the entire property. The house was named Ben Trovato, but the estate was named The Blessed Isle.
So Fred had been a bookkeeper. He had many different jobs. He had worked for the Jupiter, not the Jupiter Lighthouse, but the life saving up there. He had worked as a bookkeeper in the store, but one of the jobs he had in 1890, 1891 was the tax assessor for Dade County. And that also meant that you were the tax collector. So since people predominantly lived on the waterways and there were not any good roads or anything at all in the early 1890s, they would have to take a boat to go visit all of the houses. So here they're on a large boat with the Gilpin family, and we were actually able to find out more information about all of these people by finding Emma Gilpin's diaries, which are at the Historical Society and at History Miami. And he had good bookkeeping skills, and this is something that she wrote that was a little bit humorous. So she said, when Fred was at home between trips, he and I worked together on the tax books. I've never belonged to that grand army of women who have to count on their fingers to make change, but it does not take a brilliant mathematician to copy rows of names and figures. So they actually made 2 copies of each of the books.
This is a very famous picture of a tea party that the Deweys gave for the new reverend. And the people were so beautiful in this picture. I had a friend who's a photographer actually colorize it so you could imagine the beautiful costumes that women used to wear and men with their bowler hats and so on, to just kind of give a little bit of imagined color of what that scene was like in 1893 as they gave this party in West Palm Beach.
So by now, people, if they haven't already guessed, they're probably wondering, where was this Ben Trovato? Where was the estate? So this is a bit of an overlay of a map. So you can see Flagler Drive. Back at that time, Flagler was not filled in, so it was the natural beach area. People who lived there then said that it looked like Tahiti, and it actually took the property all the way from the water. They had riparian rights all the way to South Olive. So you might see Queen's Court there, and you can see underneath some of the little houses that were from the Sanford maps, the fire maps, the Sanborn fire maps. And then you can also see the footprint of what is there today.
Yeah, and so this was the footprint of the Dewey house was right here. And this was all filled in the 40s and 50s. That's how much they filled in to create Flagler Drive. It's hard to imagine that. And so.
Right, and so this is what it looks like today. There's two tall condominium buildings. The Rapallo that's there that faces the waterway, the Lake Worth Lagoon. We actually had talked to the manager there, and we've had our, I know this sounds kind of funny, we've had our lunch in the backyard there, so we could say we had lunch at the Blessed Isle.
So now we come to Boynton, and Mrs. Dewey was a very astute land investor. She was not just, sitting around writing her books. Both of the Deweys were land flippers. And this is how, from a very early map of the 1870s, the South County appeared. Notice that Lake Worth just ends, and you see kind of this greenish stuff. This is just a kind of a swampy area. There was no intracoastal waterway yet. It had not been dug, because that's a dug canal that goes all the way down to Fort Lauderdale, unless there's some occasional lakes like Lake Wyman and Lake Boca Raton. Otherwise, there was nothing there. And you can see there's literally nothing here. This area that's a little bit more kind of little spotty, this was the pine trees. And then the swamp began again. This lake is Lake Webster. It is now gone completely. This is the tail end of Lake Osborne, which is also the tail end is now gone completely. And so this was an area that was very interesting because the land around the lake was very, very fertile and was very favored for gardens. This area was called the Hypoluxo Garden Lands. So this is the general vicinity in which that Mrs. Dewey had decided to see some land. So she put her tropical sun opened one day, and she saw that there was 160 acres for sale of good pineapple land within a mile of Lake Worth, and in the same section as the Hypoluxo post office. So she's like, well, I'm not gonna give Mr. Charters a call. I'm going to write him a letter and actually say to him, I'm interested in your land. And she bought that land.
So there's been some popular myths over the years of certain things that had happened with someone named Linton, someone named Swinton, and someone named Boynton. So those people obviously did exist, just the story had changed from what the original story was. So this is a picture of William Linton. This is from the Library of Congress. He was a congressman from Michigan, and he actually ran for president after he had first come down here in 1896. And he was the postmaster of Saginaw, Michigan. So he came down here on a land prospecting trip. They wanted to make some money and get out of the cold and start some colonies. Colonies were big things that would happen. So people would try to get some land, whether they bought it or traded it or by hook or by crook. And then they would convince people to come down and live on that land and then collect the money and then pay their debtors. So that's William Seeley Linton. And then you'll see another Michigander. His name was Nathan Smith Boynton. So there's Mr. Boynton. They still call him Major after all these years. He served in the Civil War, and he was also did many different things. He was mayor of Port Huron. He was a newspaper publisher. He's probably most famous for founding what they call the Modern Knights of the Maccabees, which was a fraternal group. And then here's a picture of his famed hotel. So he did have this hotel built. It started out sort of as a house over in what would be the Ocean Bridge area. If you looked straight down Ocean Avenue as far east as you could go, and then slightly to the south would be the footprint of where said hotel was. Large 2-story that was added on to make it a 3-story wooden hotel, unlike the Flagler hotels. And so he invited his fellow Michiganders down as their winter home. The hotel was actually there until 1925 when it was torn down.
So this is what happens. After Mrs. Dewey bought that land for $700, that 160 acres, Linton says, I have a deal for you. I'm going to pay you $6,000. That's the equivalent today of about $250,000 for her land. Still doesn't sound like a lot of money, but $250,000 would have been quite a bit of money in 1895. But he doesn't have all the money on him. So he said, I'll pay you over 4 years. So then in March in 1897, Boynton comes along and he buys, quote unquote, the 40-acre town site from Linton. But guess what? Mr. Linton never gave the Deweys any money. So they filed a foreclosure lawsuit against Linton and Boynton. And in November, they got all of their land back. So she got her 160 acres back. And then in September 1898, the Deweys filed the plat for the town of Boynton. So they had to rewrite history a little bit because of our research to say that the true founders of the town of Boynton were Fred and Birdie Dewey. And you actually see that because they signed the plat. They were the owners of the land, and this is the original 40-acre town site of the town of Boynton. And you might say to yourself, why didn't they name the town Dewey? Well, there was a problem in that 5 miles down the road was a town called Delray. Well, you're not going to have a town called Dewey and Delray right next to each other because the mail service is going to get very messed up. Remember, they had no zip codes in those days. So the postmen had to actually read the address. So the post office would have never approved a post office called Dewey right next to one called Delray. So they kept the name Boynton because of the hotel and its fame. And that's how they did the town's official founding in 1898. And you can kind of see their signatures here. It's a little bit blurry.
So this is one of the photographs that we got from our sojourn up to Madison and Onalaska, Wisconsin. And it's a lovely picture of Fred and Birdie. These were just such great finds because originally we really didn't have any pictures of their faces. We had kind of like side views. We had our author photo, but you can see in this photo in 1900, Fred was starting to look older. He was 10 years older than she was. And then Ginger did her magic and was able to bring her more to life by adding the color. And you can see her blue eyes and her brown curls.
Yeah, she writes about how her blue eyes matched her sister's blue eyes. That's how we knew she had blue eyes, which was a lucky thing in one of her letters.
So this is something pretty awesome that had happened. We knew that they had built their house in Boynton. We knew that it was on the corner of what's today Boynton Beach Boulevard and Federal Highway. We had no idea what it looked like, but we knew that it had existed and that there had been a little footprint of it. So one night, Ginger was at her house, I was at my house, and I texted her and I just said, do you think we'll ever find a picture of the Dewey house? Well, about 15 minutes later, I got this OMG. OMG, OMG. And she sent me this photo. So
Yeah, it was honest to God, one of the strangest experiences of my life, because for Janet just to text me and say, do you think we'll ever find that picture? And I answered back, no. I said, where are we going to find a picture? And I happened to be thumbing through that night an old publication that are scanned online, that these are Flagler sales magazines to try to get people to come to Florida. And I'm just flipping the pages, and within 10 minutes of her texting me, this is what I found. And this was the Grand Dewey house as it stood there on the corner. It was short-lived. It burned down in 1916 when they had sold it to Mr. Harper, and he had it rented out, and probably somebody smoking at night, because of course the house did not have electricity, or they left something burning in the kitchen. But it's a beautiful home. Really, really, I think very striking home. You can see back here, I'm assuming the kitchen, whoops, was probably back there. Let me go back one. I think this is probably the kitchen back here, and it looks like some sort of shed back here as well. And she's got a little wagon, if you've noticed, where she probably went grocery shopping on Ocean Avenue. But you can see the pine trees were there. It was good flatwoods, and they had, of course, a fireplace. They have a chimney up here, and this feature, it's really kind of a unique home. I don't think I've ever seen one like it among the pioneer homes. So we've talked a little bit about Bruno. Bruno was the first bestseller ever written in Palm Beach County, published by Little and Brown Company, which is still a major publisher. It sold over 100,000 copies in its first year, and it was in print through 4 different editions for more than 20 years. And if you're a dog person, this is your book. It is. I've had so many people read it. I've had English professors read it, and who say that she really was the Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings of her time, that she was a very gifted writer. I've had several English professors tell me that.
So she also wrote other books. So you'll see here, these are some of her books. Bruno was reprinted several times, as I had mentioned before. I have a Foote and Davies 1924 version that I'll show you. You'll see the Gates of St. Augustine are on the one dark colored Bruno that was from 1924. And then you have her 1907 book, The Blessed Isle. And I think that she drew the sketch that is there on the front of that. One of the things that happened was we started to find some of the copies of her books, and we would actually find photographs that were taped inside. So when she would gift a book to someone, or someone she knew bought them, she would often enclose a photograph inside there. These books are very scarce now, so Ginger and I have gone ahead and we've reprinted all of her works.
And here's the sad thing about these 2 particular copies. I took this in the Florida Reading Room in West Palm Beach. They're now gone. They were stolen from the library, and so they are no longer, and written inside each book was a gift of the author. So I don't know who did that, but it's very sad. The most recent, we saw a first edition copy of Bruno on eBay last week. They wanted $900 for it. So her books have actually gone up quite a bit in value because of our research. This is just a quick picture of, this is the only known photograph of Bruno. It's not very good, but he plays in the story. Of course, he is the subject of the book. And this is his cat friend, Rebecca. And this is just some of her pamphlet forms. This is an example of one of her letters. And this is the most common version of Bruno that you will see out there. This is the 1901, and the 1909 edition had a different cover on it with her and the dog.
So by 1910, Fred was really ailing in his health. He wasn't doing well at all. So his military record shows that he was actually sent to what they call the old soldiers' home. They had several of them, but he had bad vision, he had heart problems, and somewhere along the line, he had an injury to his head. So he was sent to one old soldiers' home to another. So in 1910, that was when they sold their home in Boynton. And when they did that, they gifted boxes and boxes of their book collection to the post office as the first lending library.
This is a picture that we found taped inside of a book. And we see here, it is the last known picture of Fred Dewey that we have. This is 1907. This is their dog Van. And this is Mrs. Dewey with a very grand hat. And you notice with an ostrich feather, she would be okay with having an ostrich feather on her hat because, of course, you don't kill an ostrich to get its feather. She would have never worn egret feathers for that reason, but she's looking very, very posh there in her fine hat. This is another picture that she had several recipe entries in the Economy Administration Cookbook, which was a cookbook put out by President, his name just flew out of my head. I can't think of his name. It's not Coolidge, but he was a president that she was friends with the wife because they would vacation in West Palm Beach. And this was her portrait as it appeared in that book. I think also a very striking portrait of her. Woodrow Wilson was the president. So she was friends with the first Mrs. Wilson, who then later passed away, and her recipes appeared in that book. And this is Fred Dewey. He passed away in Los Angeles at the Sawtell Old Soldiers Home. I happened to be on a business trip a couple years ago in Los Angeles, so I had to take a visit to the cemetery there. I found his headstone and I put the book Bruno, at least one of our reprints, next to it. So that's where Fred is interred. And Mrs. Dewey lived a year in California so she could visit him every day as he was in the old soldiers' home there.
So she also was an environmentalist. So this is later on in the 1930s, and she had written a column for the Florida Naturalist. She was very active in the Florida Audubon and other Audubon societies. So this is one of her articles about bird protection, forestry, and humane.
These are, this photograph with her with the dog is actually the last known photograph we have of her from 1929 as she was visiting in Palm Beach. This picture is from 1918 with her cat Billy as she had a home on Seabreeze Avenue in Palm Beach where she lived for 4 years. So at this point she was living in Jacksonville, but she had come down most likely on the train to visit one of the Phipps family members. She was very good friends with Mrs. Phipps and all of her daughters that lived in Palm Beach. And we found her here living in, she lived in Orlando for a while. She did end up living on Home Street in Jacksonville, in South Jacksonville. And she was always flipping land. That's how she made a lot of her income.
So Mrs. Dewey passed away on April 1st, no fooling, 1942. And we actually found this article up there in Jacksonville. So it was the first obituary that we found of her.
Yeah, and I think it's really the only one we've ever found of her. And it was, you know, this was off microfilm. That's why it's of poor quality. But it also gave us a serious clue. When Janet was up there, I said, well, go ahead and look in the paper. And she's like, well, we know when she died. I said, but you don't know, there might be another clue. And it was. We had a copy of Mrs. Dewey's will, and in her will, she wanted to be cremated. But in this obituary, it said that she was buried. And so we ordered a copy of her death certificate and indeed found she had been interred, which was an unusual thing because we knew this was what her will said. So she wanted to be cremated. So, and she wanted her ashes scattered from the Breakers Pier. So what we did is we burned a photocopy of one of her pamphlets, not a real one, but a photocopy. And we took those ashes, and Janet and I went down to the Breakers Beach and we put those ashes into the water so we could at least symbolically do her wishes. But when we did find out that she was buried in Jacksonville, I called the cemetery there and was very sad to learn that Mrs. Dewey was in an unmarked grave. And that bothered me deeply. And so I had to do something about that. So we got her a little headstone, and I put on there, I had engraved on there, I am home, because that is how she described how she pictured heaven, that her animals would come back, her husband would be back, and she said we would settle into a piece of eternity. And she said, I am home. And she put those letters in capitals. So that was what I had picked for the epitaph for her headstone, which is in Jacksonville.
So when we started on this little mystery 10 years ago, you know, we were just trying to find where the Boynton Hotel was, and we had no idea that all of this would happen. So now there's some legacies left of her. In 2014, the city of Boynton Beach renamed their downtown park, which was closest to where their house was. So that's now called Dewey Park. This is something really symbolic and beautiful that she wrote. She wrote this New Year's Eve or New Year's time for 1914. I really like this one. She said, "O youth eternal, and welcoming the fulfillment of maturity, we lose not the garment of youth. We hold fast with loving trust to the joy of living. Youth of the year, youth of life, youth of the heart, trinity of happiness. Everything gilded by life's sunshine, which is power to love, a happy trust in the angel of destiny, and a loving tenderness for all created life."
So this is where the story used to end for us. But then a new chapter appeared when we were contacted by a firm that was going to develop a new hotel in West Palm Beach. And their interior design firm in Miami had somehow stumbled across Mrs. Dewey's story. And they said, we want to completely design our new hotel in West Palm Beach around her and her life. And we're going to call it the Ben. And so the Ben is open. Unfortunately, it opened just as the pandemic hit. But it's a very nice place. There's a rooftop, and I'm going to do my ad here, okay? There's a rooftop bar and restaurant, and it really features some things about Mrs. Dewey. This is a bookcase, and they had an artist do his or her, I don't know what the artist's name was, but this is a portrait of Mrs. Dewey. I know it doesn't really look like a person, but you know, it's art. So they did this, and it's all antique books, and they did this as an art display in the hotel. And here is the picture of the Deweys in Jacksonville, and they're on the elevator. On the rooftop bar is their likenesses of a photograph. So it was kind of an interesting twist that this story ended up, the whole design emphasis and inspiration for a beautiful hotel that's won numerous international awards for design. And her recipes are on the menu. She's a lot of things in the cooking of that. So it was kind of an interesting new postscript we have to our story. So that's what we have for you. Do you have any questions?
Wow, this is Steve, Ginger and Janet. That is just incredible, inspirational story, not just from the point of view of the history of the social life of the time, but the odyssey of your research, the reach that you went to, the sources that you found. It's just really incredible. If you haven't, you probably could easily teach a course to amateur historians like me, and I'll have to follow up with you later about that. Yes, okay, incredible. Anybody have a specific question for Ginger and Janet? Ted.
Two unrelated questions.
Sure.
One, I was curious if anything is known about Byrd's ethnicity. Her blue eyes and curly hair are striking. And
Yeah, from what we've been able to figure out, her most known relatives would have been from England. That's what we've been able to figure out about her heritage. Certainly on the Spilman side, she was a grandniece of Zachary Taylor. Her mother was a born Taylor, was the daughter of Zachary Taylor's brother. And so the Taylor family goes quite a bit back, but her blue eyes were quite striking. We also found a vein the Spilman name was originally Spellman, in Henry Spellman. And Mrs. Dewey is also related to Pocahontas, very distantly, of course, but she is in that whole John Smith scenario with Henry Spellman. So it even goes into that far into American history. She's related to several people who came over on the Mayflower, the infamous way that really American is you really had to come over on the Mayflower sort of thing. So yeah, we know a little bit about her heritage.
Okay, thank you. And then a totally unrelated question. Steve and I were talking about the founding of Boynton Beach, and I had thought it was, earlier than Lake Worth and so forth. And we went on Wikipedia, and then it says 1920, incorporated in 1920. And so the plat apparently was done more than 20 years before the incorporations, and the town was fairly well populated. So what form of governance or what went on that delayed the incorporation by that long? Any idea?
I think, incorporation, some people didn't want to incorporate because that meant city taxes. So a lot of times people resisted incorporation of certain areas. They would have just pretty much been, had a local magistrate probably who would settle any disputes, and any sort of legal matters would have gone to the court. They had no municipal rules, which always, can cause problems. If you go through some of the old articles, they would occasionally say is like, yeah, we finally cleaned things up. It was looking pretty shabby downtown, where they, did some serious weedings. I mean, you know how quickly stuff can get overgrown in South Florida. So they were rather self-governing. I would say most through the teens, they had a population of somewhere around 500 people, spread out mostly in small farms. It was basically a small farming community. So incorporation is always a big step for a town. They had attempted it earlier than that, and it didn't make it through, and they actually had to do it twice because they did it wrong the first time. So, and that usually means you want a little bit more control about things, but a lot of people don't want that. They want their more simple lifestyle. So I think that's really what it was. Only when they got to a certain point and it was really probably precipitated by the land boom. They wanted control over that. So a lot of towns, and you'll find, and Jupiter didn't incorporate until 1920 either, for the same reason, because it was getting out of control with developers and having no control over what things would look like and standards.
Lantana, Palm Beach, 21.
A lot of places right around that time realized the only way they could control what was going on would be to incorporate.
Yes, and of course, Lake Worth was incorporated a little bit, 1912 or 13, but it was a one development company operation.
Yeah, a little bit different.
Sort of top down, a very different kind of a situation.
Yes.
Other questions? I got one, which is, I don't know whether, I mean, you tap so many different kinds of historical sources, personal, business, land records, governmental records, and so on. What's your sense of what kind of income they had and how they made it? In other words, or maybe more importantly, the income from land flipping versus the income from book writing, for example.
Well, he made an income when he was a bank clerk, and when he did bookkeeping work, I think he did okay. I'm pretty certain that once he passed away, he died in 1919, and then it was the Roaring 20s, and she sold her last lots in Boynton and some other land holdings she had around. So I think she had cash on hand. Well, cash on hand was in a bank was the worst thing that you could have done in the 20s, because what happened in 29? The banks crashed. And I can tell you she died poor. She had, there was a big fight over her meager estate between her caretaker, who had taken her in when she died in her mid to late 80s, and her nieces and nephews fought over the entire value of her estate, which was basically her house, her furnishings, and 6 boxes of Bruno. And they fought all the way to the Florida Supreme Court over the $1,600, finally deciding to split it 800 and 800. And so I think she lost a lot of money in the bank failures of the late 1920s and did not leave her with a lot of income. She had a small pension from somebody in an estate, like $100 a month. And then she would have had her husband's soldier's pension, which was $25 a month. I mean, these are not big sums, but she wasn't going to starve. But a lot of people think, oh my God, she must have died fabulously wealthy, and she didn't. Now, today, if you had the land that they had, they would be fabulously wealthy. He had bought 2 square miles in Broward County for the $1.50 an acre each one, and they flipped those pretty quickly. But can you imagine owning 2 square miles in prime areas of Broward County today? I think you'd be quite wealthy.
Great, thank you. Anybody else got a question? Speak up.
Ginger, tell them about the reprints.
Yeah, did you have the books to hold up, or?
I do, but I only see the screen.
Oh, well, you can hold it up against yourself and then we'll see them.
Oh, okay. All
I
right.
have.
And that's all I have here, unless
I'm holding up the Dewey book. You probably can't see it very well.
Yeah, let me stop sharing, and then that should help, Jen. If you talk, then they'll see you.
Okay. Hello. Let's see.
There you are.
So there were several different reincarnations of her books. So this is one of the earliest ones.
You have to hold it up against yourself, like
Oh,
exactly in front of you, because of the background.
You've seen the picture of that one before. And then there is the one with the picture of St. Augustine.
Yep.
And then this is kind of like a mod one, like a 1920s, kind of worn out. It was even printed into paperback. I didn't even know they had paperback back then. And then this is her Blessed Isle. And then we've had her books reprinted. This is Bruno. And then her collected works.
So all of the books are available on Amazon if you'd like to purchase them. You can buy the collected works, which is all of her known works in one single book. It includes all 3, Bruno, the Palm Woods, or Pine Groves to Palm Woods, or I always get those 2 mixed up. And then the Blessed Isle, including all of her short stories, all of her known magazine articles that we have, and all of her newspaper articles that she did, that we know that she did. I'm sure she published a lot with no byline, so we would have no way of finding those. But the collected works has everything in it. And Bruno is always a very touching story. The one I like the most is From Pine Woods to Palm Groves, because it is the only book that describes how Palm Beach County was in 1887. And it has some really hilarious stories in it. One of my favorites is when she's alone in this house and there is nobody for miles, and it's her. And Fred would row across to Palm Beach to work in the store. And she looks up one day at her screen door, and there stands a Seminole Indian. And she really didn't know what to do. I mean, she's like, she didn't know, was this guy going to kill her? Was he going to rape her? What? And he simply said, I want boat. And her husband kept a small rowboat out back. He wanted to row across Lake Mangonia so that he could go back home. And she said, good Indian, bring boat back tomorrow. And he says, yes. And they just both stood there staring at each other. And he finally says, good day. And she said, good day. And she fainted. Because she said, the cats woke me up by licking me on the face. But, we can't even imagine such a thing as that. There was absolutely nobody there. The nearest neighbor would have been Elbridge Gale, who wasn't there all the time. He was the man who brought mangoes to Palm Beach County. He was the horticulturist from Kansas State, and his wife didn't live here. She's like, you can live there, I'm not living there. And he didn't. And his daughter lived here later, Hattie, and she became our first school teacher. But can you imagine, not one single person they were, there was a couple of houses in what would have been downtown West Palm Beach today, but there was nothing up in Northwood Hills. I mean, they're like, what the heck are you living there for? And that's really why they moved on the waterfront. But even then, they were not considered in the town. They were 1 mile south of downtown West Palm Beach, as they lived on their Ben Trovato estate. And that estate was, that house was torn down in 1970. That's how long it made it. And it was subsequently owned by a Dr. Baldwin. And we were able to contact the woman who grew up in that house. And she's still with us. She lives in Beaumont, Texas. She just turned 90. And she was able to draw us the interior layout of the house, which was amazing. And she knew nothing of the history, nothing who had built the house, why it looked the way it did. So we were able to give her back the whole history of the house that she grew up in. And that was really a neat thing to do.
Wow.
She's the one that had the pictures where it looked like Tahiti.
Yeah, and they owned that piece of land. So it was originally a 5-acre piece, and then Olive Avenue, when it went through, cut it in half. And so the people sold the half that was from Olive Avenue to Dixie, and that became one of those first neighborhoods. And they still had the rest of the estate until 1970.
Wow. Well, we look forward to getting our copies of the book. That's quite a sort of public and literary service to make those available again. I mean, that really is bringing history
Well, I
alive.
really
It's
wanted
fantastic.
to do that. I didn't want her works to die out or be just, these weird reprints that they do overseas. I wanted it to be, so we actually retypeset all of the books. They're not photocopies of her books. They were completely retyped and retypeset with the photographs. So they're a much easier reading experience. You can also get Kindle. It's available on Kindle. If you like Kindle, you can get that from Amazon as well.
Fantastic. Okay, well, listen, this has just been an incredible experience in terms of the history, in terms of the lifestyle, in terms of how historians can put together a lot, starting from almost nothing if they, well, have a lot of knowledge as well as a lot of energy. It's really been entertaining, and I want to extend the thanks of everybody in the Historical Society of Lake Worth to you, and we look forward to having some future interaction with you as individuals and with the Boynton Beach Historical Society as time goes on.